right. Let's dive into ancient Hebrew history. But we're not just talking about, dusty scrolls and biblical tales here.
Right.
We're going deep into the battles and conquests.
Yeah, the moments that decided the fate of nations, really.
Exactly. So for anyone who loves military history, who is fascinated by the ripple effects, how these things impact Europe and the world even today.
Absolutely. I mean, these conflicts, they weren't just some isolated skirmishes, They shaped empires, they influenced military strategies that honestly we still study today. And I mean, they basically drew the map of Europe as we know it.
Yeah, and we're going beyond just the surface level here.
Oh, yeah.
We're looking at ancient texts, but also historical records, trying to piece together the bigger picture, how these ancient battles fit into the whole story of European history. So, first things first. Who are the Hebrews? Where do they fit into this military landscape?
Well, the term Hebrews itself, that's already a whole story. The Egyptians, they first ran into a group they called Israelites, probably from the northern kingdom of Israel. And over time, this name, it just sort of became like the blanket term for all these Hebrew groups, even though they weren't all the same.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with only a few pieces. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
We get these little glimpses.
Yeah.
If from the Egyptians, they have this Israel steel.
Right.
Where Pharaoh Merneptah, he's bragging about, crushing Israel in 1223 BCE.
Yeah, that's the first time Israel pops up in history.
Wow.
It shows just how tough it was for those early kingdoms.
Always fighting to survive, huh?
Oh, constantly. Always these huge empires breathing down their necks. And that's where the whole Hebrews, Israelites, Jews thing gets even more interesting.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, Jews actually comes from the southern kingdom of Judah. It changed over time with translations and, how language evolves.
So we have these two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, always navigating this really complicated world. What happened next in this fight for survival?
Well, the northern kingdom, Israel, they eventually fell to the Assyrian Empire, big power in Mesopotamia. That was in 722 BCE.
Right.
Judah, they hung on a bit longer.
Okay.
But they basically became like a puppet state for the Assyrians.
A vassal state.
Exactly. But then you have Nebuchadnezzar II and the Babylonians, another Mesopotamian powerhouse.
This is the Hanging Gardens guy, right?
Oh, yeah, that was him. And he was a serious military force, too. Took down the Assyrians and then set his sights on Judah.
So that leads to the Babylonian captivity in 586 BCE.
Right, a real turning point. Jerusalem destroyed, Hebrews exiled. They had to figure out, how do we keep our identity when everything's been ripped away?
And from that, the Old Testament, or Tanakh, starts to come together.
Yeah. It's more than just a religious book. It's their history, their resilience. It's how they held on to their culture and beliefs when they lost everything.
Imagine that. You're in a foreign land, your temple's gone, your future's uncertain.
Writing it all down, it's almost an act of defiance, like saying, we're not going anywhere.
Powerful.
Yeah.
And that leads to the big figures, the stories that made up Hebrew identity. Adam and Eve, Noah, the Tower of Babel, those stories that have shaped not just religion, but how we see ourselves in the world.
Even if you see them as myths, they give you a look into how they saw the world, like the promised land, given to Abraham and his descendants by God. That becomes central to who they are.
Shows how deep that connection between people and land can be.
Yeah.
Still a source of conflict today, really.
Yeah.
And the Tower of Babel, trying to explain all these different languages, like a warning about ambition, maybe.
Right, and maybe a reminder to understand each other.
And then you have the big names, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who, by the way, became Israel.
Right.
And his 12 sons. They became the 12 tribes of Israel. These are the guys who gave them a sense of family, of shared history. Really important when you're constantly under threat.
They're the anchors.
Exactly. Those stories provide a sense of, continuity, a shared heritage in a world that feels like it's always changing.
Definitely. And speaking of anchors, you can't forget King David.
The warrior king. His image has become like the symbol of leadership. We see it everywhere. Art, literature, all through history.
David's story, whether it's all true or not, shows how powerful stories can be.
In shaping history.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He becomes the symbol of resilience, uniting his people, building a kingdom. But we do have to acknowledge there's a lot of debate about how accurate these stories really are.
Right. Some scholars say a lot of what we read in the Old Testament, it was written or reinterpreted during the exile to create a sense of unity, a shared purpose.
It's a fascinating idea. It makes you think about how history gets written, whose voices get heard, how stories change over time, especially for groups that have been through so much.
So they come out of this exile with a written history, a stronger sense of who they are, and this new idea, the Messiah, a savior who will free them from oppression.
And that idea, it was completely unique to Judaism at that time. But it would have a huge impact. It laid the groundwork for both Christianity and Islam,
Wow.
two of the biggest religions in the world, showing how powerful ideas born from conflict can be.
And the story doesn't end there.
No, not at all.
The Roman Empire is on the rise. And that means a whole new era of conflict, one that will shape their future and leave its mark on Europe.
And that's where we'll pick up next time, the clash between the Hebrews and the mighty Roman Empire, a conflict that will echo through history. So we left off with the Hebrews facing this new challenge, the rise of Rome.
Right.
It's 63 BCE. The Roman general Pompey, he marches into Judea, conquers it.
And that's the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, right?
Yeah, they'd only been in charge for like a few decades.
Wow. So this is a huge power shift, the start of direct Roman rule.
Exactly. Imagine being a Hebrew in Judea at this time. You've seen empires come and go, you've been through exile, hardship, and now you're under the thumb of Rome. What do?
It must have been a really complex situation.
It was. Some Hebrews, they saw the Romans as like a stabilizing force, you know? Others saw them as oppressors. And you start to see these different Jewish groups emerge,
Oh, okay.
each with their own idea of how to live under Roman rule. You had the Pharisees, super strict about Jewish law.
Right.
The Sadducees, a bit more willing to work with the Romans. And the Essenes, they basically went out to the desert looking for spiritual purity.
It's like Roman occupation forced them to figure out who they were.
Yeah, in a way.
What about Jesus and his followers? Weren't they around then too?
Absolutely. His story happens right in the middle of all this.
Right.
His teachings, rooted in Jewish tradition, they offered something totally new.
Okay.
A vision of hope, of liberation, and it really resonated with a lot of people.
And this movement, it eventually becomes Christianity.
Right.
And spreads throughout the Roman Empire, changes everything.
It does.
But that's a story for another deep dive. For now, let's stick with the military and political scene, especially this rivalry between Rome and Parthia.
Yeah, it had a big impact on Judea and on how warfare developed.
So remind me, who are the Parthians?
They were based in like what's now Iran.
Okay.
And they were a force to be reckoned with. Masters of mounted warfare, amazing cavalry, incredible archers.
Right.
Their signature move was this thing called the Parthian shot.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
They'd pretend to retreat, then turn around on their horses and just unleash this storm of arrows.
That's brilliant. It's strategy and psychological warfare all in one.
Totally. You think you're winning, and suddenly you're getting hit from behind.
So how did the Romans deal with that?
They had to adapt. The Parthians forced them to rethink their whole approach to war. They started using more cavalry. They even picked up some Parthian tricks.
Like what?
Heavier armor, using archers on horseback.
So even the Romans, with all their power, they were willing to learn from their enemies. That's smart. Shows you how strategic they were.
Exactly. And needing to counter the Parthians, it led to all these changes in Roman warfare.
Right.
Changes that impacted their campaigns across the empire. Shows you even the biggest empires, they have to keep evolving.
To stay ahead.
Exactly. It's amazing, isn't it, how this conflict in one part of the world could have such a huge impact.
It really is.
Pushing military advancements, shaping the course of history.
So what about the Hebrews? Where do they fit into all of this?
Well, it was tough for them.
Right.
They were caught in the middle.
Between Rome and Parthia.
Exactly. Forced to choose sides or try to stay neutral. And there were always consequences, no matter what they did.
So this was a time of instability, of unrest.
Oh, yeah.
The Hebrews just trying to hold on to their identity, their freedom, with these empires battling around them.
It's a reminder that those big stories, the empires and wars, they always affect real people.
Right.
People forced to make impossible choices. People who have to deal with the consequences.
It's easy to forget that, looking back.
It is. And those choices, those struggles, they would keep shaping the Hebrews for centuries.
It's all part of their story.
It is. But to really understand how all this affected history, we need to look closer at those Roman-Parthian wars. We're talking like major conflicts here, not just little border fights. These Roman-Parthian wars, they were huge. They went on for centuries.
Wow.
And they changed everything for these empires.
Yeah, they must have had a big impact on like military strategy, the way wars were fought, the technology they used.
Absolutely. I mean, we talked about the Parthians, how good they were with their horse archers. The Romans had to adapt.
Right. But were there any specific battles or moments that really stand out?
Oh, yeah, definitely. One that comes to mind is the Battle of Kara, 53 BCE. The Parthians, led by this general, Serena, they just completely outmaneuvered the Romans. Led by Marcus Licinius Crassus, the Romans were crushed.
So it wasn't just a little loss for them.
Oh no, it was a major defeat. It really shook their confidence, and it showed just how effective the Parthian tactics were.
So Kari became like a lesson for them.
Yeah, a lesson in not underestimating your enemy and in being ready to adapt to different ways of fighting.
The Romans, they were known for their legions, right?
Yeah, very disciplined infantry, heavy armor.
But that didn't work against the Parthians.
Nope, they weren't prepared for those lightning-fast cavalry charges. And those archers, man, they were devastating.
Sounds like a classic clash of styles. Roman strength versus Parthian speed. How did this affect the rest of the wars?
The Romans, they learned from their mistakes. They realized they needed to be more flexible, more mobile, to counter the Parthians.
So what did they do?
They started using more cavalry themselves, experimented with lighter armor. They even trained their own archers to go up against the Parthian horse archers.
So the Parthians actually forced the Romans to change, to get better.
In a way, yeah. They became like this catalyst for innovation in the Roman army.
That's fascinating. But it wasn't just about tactics and equipment, right?
No, the Romans had to change their whole strategy too.
What do you mean?
They couldn't just conquer and hold territory in the east the same way they did elsewhere.
Why not? What was different about the East?
Well, the distances were huge, the terrain was rough, and the Parthians were masters of hit-and-run tactics.
So it was hard to keep control of the areas they conquered.
Exactly. They had to start relying more on diplomacy, making alliances with local leaders, and governing in a less centralized way.
So they had to become more political, not just military.
You got it. And that change in thinking, it had a big impact on the Roman Empire.
How so?
It forced them to be more practical, to realize they couldn't control everything, and to understand the different cultures, the different political situations in their empire.
It sounds like those wars, even though they didn't fully conquer the Parthians, they taught the Romans a lot.
They did. And those lessons, they shaped the empire, and they influenced how they fought wars from then on.
Wow. So even though Rome eventually fell, those lessons lived on.
Oh yeah, definitely. The Roman-Parthian Wars, they might not be as famous as some of Rome's other conflicts, but they played a huge role in shaping European military history.
Because they forced the Romans to change, to innovate, to really think about how to fight wars on a huge scale.
Absolutely. It's incredible, isn't it?
It is. That battles fought so long ago can still teach us things today.
They show us that being strong isn't just about brute force. It's about being adaptable.
Thinking strategically.
And learning from your wins and your losses.
Wow, that's a great point. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from those early mentions of the Hebrews and Egyptian records, through their battles against huge empires, to this amazing rivalry between Rome and Parthia. It's been a wild ride through ancient conflicts and their impact on European history.
And it shows how connected the past and the present really are. Those ancient struggles for power, for land, for identity, they still echo in the world today.
They do. They shape how we think about conflict, about strategy, about the balance of power.
Exactly. History isn't just names and dates in a book. It's a living story that still shapes our world.
That's a great way to put it. So when you're learning about military history, remember to look beyond the battles themselves.
Think about the bigger picture, the long-term effects.
The legacies of these ancient conflicts. Because those stories can teach us about ambition, about power, about the fight for survival and identity.
They really can.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Hebrew history and the epic clashes that shaped their world and ours. We'll see you next time for another journey into the depths of history.